Welcome to Dark Notes. There are some children that history forgets and others it tries to erase. Imagine this. A pale girl with cold grey eyes staring silently through a frost-lined window. The air is heavy, the room breathless. She turns to her mother and says, "Mr. Dietrich will die today." 14 minutes past 2. Not a guess, a declaration, and she's right, down to the minute. That was the day Milwaukee stopped calling her gifted and started calling her cursed. Her name was Emma Richter. And in the bitter winter of 1873, she became something that frightened both faith and reason, an anomaly, a threat, a mirror no one wanted to look into. Because Emma didn't just calculate, she knew. She could observe, record, and deduce until your deepest sins were laid bare without a word spoken in your defense. No priest could explain her, no doctor could contain her, and no institution wanted the world to know what she represented, a mind that worked outside of time, and a memory that never ever forgot. This isn't just a tale of genius, it's the story of fear cloaked in numbers, of secrets dragged from polite society's shadows by a child who never raised her voice. It is the descent of a community into madness, led not by demons or disease, but by the unbearable weight of truth revealed too clearly, too early, by a girl who should never have existed. But she did, and what she uncovered is something you weren't supposed to know. Milwaukee, 1873, a city half built on industry, half on silence. A place where secrets festered beneath the cobblestones and the scent of yeast from the breweries masked more than beer. In the German Quarter, a tight-knit enclave of immigrants, clinging to their old-world traditions, Richter was born 3 weeks premature in the belly of a storm on an Atlantic crossing that nearly killed her mother. She came into the world, not screaming, but silent, pale, watching, and she never stopped. By the time she was 4, she could recite entire conversations from memory, days after they occurred, repeating not only the words, but the tone, the breath, pauses, the unconscious sighs. It wasn't mimicry, it was data recall, and it terrified everyone who heard it. By 6, she was solving complex mathematical sequences faster than her father, a trained brewmaster, could write them down. By 8, she could determine a man's likelihood of infidelity based on the pattern of his steps walking home. Not speculation, prediction, with margins of error calculated and footnoted. But it was in the winter of 1873 that the town began to understand that Emma wasn't just special. She was dangerous, not because of what she could do, but because of what she could see. Her parents, Hinrich and Greta Richter, were hard-working, humble people. German immigrants who believed in God, discipline, and keeping one's head down. They didn't ask for a child like Emma, and they certainly weren't prepared for what she became. At first they encouraged her abilities the way parents do when they think they've birthed a prodigy. But then came the predictions, deaths, affairs, crimes, things a child should not know, let alone say out loud. She didn't scream, she didn't warn, she stated. Her tone was always calm, clinical, exact, and when her predictions came true again and again, the community turned on her father Collar, who once called her a divine vessel, began preaching about the dangers of unnatural knowledge. Neighbors crossed themselves when she passed. Children were pulled off sidewalks and forbidden to speak her name. But Emma didn't care. She wasn't looking for friends, she was collecting data. By February she had memorized the gait pattern of every person on Galena Street. She could tell who was lying based on their blink intervals and voice pitch deviations. She could predict arguments days before they happened. She could trace thefts, illnesses, deaths, not through prophecy, probability, and that's when the disappearances began. The first was subtle. A boy named Lucas, a bruised child, often scolded harshly in public. One morning he simply didn't show up for school. His mother claimed he'd gone to visit an aunt in Kenosha, but Emma's journal discovered later contained an entry, dated 2 weeks prior. Lucas' bruising pattern indicates parental violence. Crying frequency increased. Emotional breakdown likely. Probability of accidental death within 16 days, 89%. No one believed her, until Lucas was found, dead, in a well. 14 days after Emma's entry, the town refused to acknowledge the coincidence. But fear doesn't ask for permission. It spreads, infects. And Emma, she kept counting. That's when she started the Black Ledger, a small leather-bound journal, hidden under her mattress, filled not with thoughts but observations, numbers, timelines, patterns of guilt, movements of liars, maps of betrayal. It was her second language. But to the people of Milwaukee, it was her grimoire. Doctors were called, scientists, priests. None could explain her. The term savant had not yet entered common use. To them, Emma was something older, something forbidden. The old women called her Natchkind, night child, The priests whispered of possession, and the doctors, most damning of all, began to talk of institutionalization, but Emma saw it coming, and she prepared. What terrified the authorities was not what Emma knew, that it was that she never spoke, unless she was right, and she was always right. You were never supposed to hear this story. It was buried, the journal was taken, the remaining pages locked away in the archives of a Milwaukee hospital that burned to the ground in 1892. Emma's family vanished. Official records list them as having moved west, but there are no property deeds, no census data, no graves, and Emma, she left behind only the black ledger, and a trail of mathematical fingerprints too, precise to be chance. And here's where the descent truly begins. Because what Emma discovered, the system she developed, isn't lost. It's replicated, institutionalized. WEAPONIZED. What if I told you that the way she read patterns is now how algorithms read you? That her raw ability, the power to reduce a man's soul to predictable behavior, has become the backbone of surveillance states and behavioral prediction systems. What she did in one small town has been scaled, industrialized, and now they watch you like she watched them. But without her morality, without her stillness, without her warning. Are you starting to feel it? The air shifting, the descent beginning. Then pay close attention, because Emma's black ledger was not a journal. It was a blueprint, and the next 19 sections. They're going to show you exactly how it works and why once you understand it, you'll never see your own life the same way again. Before we continue, if you're still with me, if you can feel the transformation beginning, type the phrase "I see through the system" twice in the comments. Not for me, for you. To lock it in. To mark the moment you stopped being a subject and started becoming a sovereign. Now let's keep going. Because the girl who shouldn't exist, she saw more than secrets. She saw everything. In the annals of forbidden history, there's a type of intelligence so raw, so utterly ungoverned by emotion or bias, that it ceases to be human and becomes something else entirely, a mirror too clear, a blade too sharp. Emma Richter was not an oracle, she was not a prophet. She was the first exposed nerve of a system that had been hiding beneath society's skin for centuries, a system that functions in patterns, thrives in silence, and punishes those who can see it clearly. Her black ledger, the one no one dared read aloud, was never meant for storytelling. It was an architecture of collapse. In it, Emma didn't write what happened. She wrote what would. She wasn't documenting, she was predicting. And if you truly understand that, then you'll begin to see the deeper horror, that nothing in her world nor yours was ever truly random. Inside those leather pages were thousands of entries, small notations in perfect columns, dates, initials, step counts, emotional deviations, sentence structures. She catalogued the patterns of every person on Galena Street, cross-referenced them with their diets, their moods, their relationships. And then, she extrapolated. When a man's drinking increased by 14% and his speech slowed by 6%, she calculated a 73% chance of violence within the week. When a woman altered her walking pattern by more than 20%, 3 days in a row, Emma predicted emotional distress or infidelity within 5. It wasn't magic, it was mathematics. Cold, precise, terrifying mathematics. This kind of thinking, this forbidden clarity, doesn't come from school books. It emerges only when a mind exists outside of the box. Most people never question. Emma was born during a storm, not just of weather but of intention. She represented a mutation, a rupture in the timeline of what humans are supposed to be capable of. And Milwaukee's German quarter responded the only way it knew how, with fear, repression, and quiet institutional violence. Because behind the lace curtains and polished shoes, these people were hiding things: affairs, crimes, incest, greed, abuse. And when Emma began to predict not just what would happen, but whether ledger became a death sentence. Dr. Friedrich Müller, the community physician, was the only man who attempted to engage her as an equal. He saw the ledger for what it was, a model of behavioral forecasting decades ahead of its time. But even he underestimated it. He asked Emma once, "If I showed you a stranger for 3 days, could you predict their death?" Emma didn't blink. Yes, in most cases, 3 days is enough to reach 90% accuracy. Is it always death? No, she said. Sometimes it's worse. There was an entry in the ledger dated March 27, 1873. FM body language 17% tighter. Left hand tremor increasing. Blink rate accelerated when discussing asylum records. Concealing something. Probability of institutional betrayal 84%. FM was Dr. Müller. She knew he would betray her, and she documented it. 3 days later, he attempted to convince Hinrich and Greta to send Emma to the Milwaukee County Hospital for the insane. Not for punishment, of course. For observation. For help. That word help. It's the lie systems always tell before they cage the minds that see too much. Emma didn't resist. She didn't scream. She simply handed her father the ledger and said, "Read page 88 before you decide." He didn't. He was too afraid. But had he turned to page 88, he would have found this entry. "Father will not read this." Fear response overrides curiosity. Trust has limits. By May, the system will reclaim me. Journal will be gone. Memory will become threat. Threat. Not tragedy. Threat. Because a girl like Emma is not allowed to grow up. Do you understand? The system is not afraid of pain. It's afraid of clarity. Of unfiltered, data-driven truth. The kind of clarity that doesn't care about feelings, reputations, or hierarchies. That's why Emma was erased. Not because she was dangerous in the way they said, disturbed, unsocial, cold, but because she understood the algorithm of human failure. She decoded the rhythm of society's rot, and she wrote it down. In the spring of 1873, 3 events occurred in rapid succession. The Weber-Kellner affair erupted into full scandal, leading to the closure of the brewery office for 2 weeks. A young boy named Anselm went missing. Another child Emma had logged as high risk, due to a set of observed bruises and dietary inconsistencies. And finally, Emma herself was taken. There are no official records of the removal, no hospital logs, no doctor's note. Only one final entry in the ledger, discovered decades later inside the walls of a collapsed schoolhouse. May 6, 1873. "They are coming." Mama weeps. Papa pretends not to know. "They will take me to silence the pattern. But it's too late. It's everywhere now. Let that settle. It's everywhere now." Emma was 11, but she saw what institutions couldn't admit, that human behavior is predictable and that if you can predict, you can control. Now ask yourself this: who else is watching you this way? Who else is counting your clicks, your pauses, your hesitations? Because Emma's ledger became your algorithm, that it was never destroyed. It was repurposed. Her methods, the same logic she used to predict adultery, death, betrayal, were studied, copied, refined, fed into machines. Your feed, your ads, your scrolling behaviors. They're not random, they're calculations. The very same kind Emma wrote in a forgotten bedroom, in a forgotten quarter, in a time when people still believed children couldn't break the world. She didn't break it. She revealed it, and now it's watching you. Right now, you paused on this video. You've read this far, so tell me, how predictable are you? Next we go deeper into how Emma's ledger resurfaced in 1911, and how the patterns she tracked started appearing in institutional experiments across the United States. Experiments involving orphans, identical twins, and children with impossible cognitive skills. What if I told you Emma was not the only one? What if I told you she was the first model? Keep going, you've already crossed the line. 14 nuns sealed themselves away forever. No headings, no labels, just raw cinematic narration. The priest who arrived from Rome was not the kind of man who asked questions. He was sent to deliver absolution, not to seek understanding. But even he's seasoned by decades of spiritual warfare, exorcisms, and the quiet politics of the Vatican trembled when he entered the gates of the convent. The stone walls, blackened by time and rain, seemed to watch him. The air wasn't just still, it was alert, like something ancient had awoken and was holding its breath. He found the Mother Superior waiting in the cloister garden, hands folded, eyes fixed on a dead rosebush. She didn't greet him with reverence. She didn't smile. She only whispered. They heard it again. This time, it called them by name. That was when the Vatican's veil of silence truly descended. The Church archived the case under what they call Obambersotha, shadow files accounts, too dangerous for the faithful, too destabilizing for the world. But we have one transcript, one that was smuggled out by a young nun who vanished a week after delivering it. According to her testimony, the voice they heard in the walls did not speak in Latin, Greek, or Aramaic, but in a language none of them recognized. Yet all instinctively obeyed, not understood, obeyed. The younger novices began chanting words in their sleep, words that caused birds to fall from the sky. Candles wouldn't stay lit for more than a few seconds. Mirrors had to be removed entirely. They stopped reflecting their faces. What was most disturbing, however, were the drawings. Sketches began appearing on the stone floors and wooden beams, carved with fingernails and broken rosaries. The shapes weren't symbols, they were maps. Maps of corridors that didn't exist, staircases that led nowhere, When one of the sisters tried following one of these imagined paths just to prove it was madness, she disappeared. They heard her screaming from behind the kitchen wall for 7 hours. Then silence. When the workers tore it down days later, they found nothing. No body, no opening, no sign of struggle, just a single word scratched into the brick. Beneath, the word began to spread among the remaining sisters like an infection. One began sewing it into her bedsheets. Another painted it with candle wax across the communion table. Beneath what? Beneath the chapel, beneath the convent itself. It wasn't clear, until one of the older nun, Sister Magdalene, told the others a secret that had been passed down only to the eldest member of the order for 300 years, that the convent had been built atop something far older than the church itself. Beneath the foundations was a sealed crypt, one that predates Christianity, predates Rome, perhaps even predates human civilization. The records describe it not as a structure, but as a womb, not a tomb, a womb, a place not of death, but of gestation, of becoming. The night Sister Magdalene revealed this. She took her own life, left behind a note soaked in blood that said, "It remembers." At this point, the church wanted the convent razed. Quietly, of course, without attention. But when the demolition crew arrived, they refused to enter the chapel. Not out of fear, because of sound. The low hum, a vibration felt in the teeth and bones. One man claimed it was a frequency not meant for human ears. Another vomited blood and went blind in one eye. They fled, and the nuns, now 12, locked the gates behind them. 2 had already died. The church declared the convent abandoned. But no, it wasn't. It had transformed into something else. Something ancient. Something that did not pray to the God we know, but to something older, darker, and perhaps truer. Years passed. The Vatican stationed a watcher, monks stationed at a nearby farmhouse with instructions never to approach, only to observe. He kept a log. The final entry, scrawled and shaky, read, "They no longer cast shadows." What does that mean? No one knows, but it matches a detail from a medieval text stored deep in the Vatican's forbidden section, Codex Tenebris. It described a monastery in the Pyrenees in 1231, where the monks began exhibiting the same trait, shadowless, breathless, and then gone, every last one, as if absorbed into the stone itself. That's the pattern, that's the fate. But here's where it gets worse. In 1989, a team of American researchers from a private university and affiliated with the church managed to access the convent site under the guise of historical preservation. They didn't announce their visit, they didn't leave a public record. But we found a single recording never aired, never published, dumped in an archive mislabeled under Civil War audio logs. The tape begins with static, wind, and the crunch of boots on stone. Then comes the voice of a woman, presumably the lead researcher, describing the state of the ruins. And then silence. 30 seconds. 40. Then a faint sound. Not voices, not chanting, breathing, from multiple directions. Panicked whispers follow. The woman says, "There's someone behind the altar." Another voice replies, "No, not." Someone, something, screaming, running, then nothing but a single tone. A tone that lasts exactly 13 minutes and 13 seconds. No background noise, just the tone. The same frequency the demolition crew heard. The university denied the team was ever there. Their families were paid off. The church, through its usual channels, reburied the site in concrete, declared it a seismic hazard. And once again, the story disappeared. But stories like this don't vanish. They ferment. They root in the subconscious like seeds in wet soil, growing, twisting, until entire cultures are shaped around forgetting them. And maybe that's the point. Because if you remember, if you speak it aloud, if you follow that map beneath the chapel, then maybe, just maybe, it remembers you back. So why did the 14 nuns seal themselves away forever? Because they knew that silence was the only shield left, that prayer had failed, that the church would not save them, that the sound was spreading, and that if even one word escaped into the world, one syllable of that impossible tongue, it could spread like a virus through dreams, through breath, through prayer itself. Their vow wasn't of chastity or poverty, it was of containment, and they kept it, until now. Because now, you've heard it. You've heard the first line of a hymn that was never meant for human ears, and you'll hear it again, not in words, not in language, but in silence, in the pause before sleep, in the dark space between thoughts, in the hum of old buildings, in the quiet between heartbeats. This is how it begins. Again, again. But perhaps the most unsettling element of the entire affair was the vow itself, the vow of silence. 14 nuns, not all from the same order, not all from the same background, and certainly not all known to one another prior to the night of March 9, 1912. entered that crumbling stone convent in upstate New York, and never spoke to anyone outside its walls again. Not a word, not even to their families. Some of them had siblings, cousins, or even elderly parents who begged for answers. Letters were sent, priests intervened, local bishops were contacted, but nothing ever came out of those walls again. Silence. Like a dead radio, the kind of silence that grows heavier the longer you listen to it. Over the years, whispers passed between small communities. One of the women had allegedly been a witness to something terrible before entering. Another had been involved in an exorcism that went horrifically wrong. A third was said to have once studied medicine before mysteriously switching to theology after a stint at a sanitarium. Patterns began to form, but none were ever confirmed. And if you try to investigate it today, you'll find a wall of archived files stamped with institutional seals that haven't been used in decades, many of them misplaced or under restoration. You'll find that the convent itself burned down in 1963 under strange circumstances. The fire department records listing the blaze as rapidly spreading, with unknown ignition source, presumed electrical, but that's not even the most peculiar part. What's truly unsettling is that when the firemen breached the front doors, they didn't find 14 bodies, they didn't find 10, they didn't even find one. They found nothing, no bones, no clothing, no traces of anyone having lived there in years, and yet there were fresh linens on the beds, warm food on the table, and handwritten notes scattered across the chapel floor, all of them containing a single phrase in Latin: veritas non loquat. Truth does not speak. And this is where we dive even deeper, because there's something profoundly unnatural about silence when it's absolute. Silence in nature still breathes wind, insects, footsteps, but silence created by human design, that's something else. That's a wall, a gate, a system of control. And when that system involves faith, belief, and women once dedicated to caring for the sick and the abandoned, you're looking at something much darker. Remember, these convents weren't just places of worship, especially in the 19th and early 20th century. They were also halfway houses for women who'd seen too much, places where secrets were buried not just spiritually, but bureaucratically. If a girl got pregnant out of wedlock, she might be sent to the convent to atone. If a woman saw something she wasn't meant to see, a Masonic ritual, a military experiment, a private sermon given to the elite, she might be offered a choice: speak and be ruined, or join the sisterhood and disappear into piety. Silence became the coin of survival. But what makes these 14 different is that they all came from different dioceses. They weren't from the same town, the same parish, or even the same region. Yet within 48 hours of each other, they arrived, one by one, and locked themselves in. There was no press release, no public statement, just the sound of that iron gate closing, the bell tolling once, and then nothing. Decades passed. Most people forgot. But every so often, a parish record would show something strange, a notation by a confused priest who attempted to visit the convent but was turned away by a nun who spoke only in gestures, a donation sent from a mysterious benefactor who insisted it be used to fund the Silent Women of Larchmont Hill. That's what they called it, Larchmont Hill. But if you look for it now, it's just a field, overgrown, forgotten, no signs, no foundation stones, nothing. And yet, if you stand there long enough, people say you feel something, a pressure in your ears, like being deep underwater, as if the silence is still there, watching, listening, warning. So what could drive 14 women, educated, devout, experienced, to make such a choice? There are theories, of course. One involves a letter recovered from the ruins after the fire. It was partially burned, and much of the ink had bled away. But the final line was still visible. It read, "We do not protect the world from evil, we protect the world from knowing." That line alone has led some researchers to believe these nuns weren't merely hiding, they were guardians, custodians of some ancient or forbidden knowledge so powerful, so destabilizing, that to even speak of it would risk unleashing it. Some tie it to the writings of St. Hildegard, whose mystical visions spoke of a future in which the church would fracture under the weight of its own lies. Others point to older sources, apocryphal texts, letters attributed to early church fathers, even Gnostic scrolls never formally acknowledged by Rome. But the deeper you dig, the more you realize something else. This wasn't just a religious matter. Government records from the early 20th century show that federal agents made 3 unannounced visits to the convent between 1914 and 1939. No reason was ever given. No reports were ever filed. But the mere presence of federal interest in a small, silent convent in rural New York suggests that what these women knew wasn't confined to theology. It was geopolitical, philosophical, possibly even scientific. There's one more detail. that has never been explained. During the 1950 census, an agent marked the convent as not operational. When asked why, he allegedly replied, "Because no one there is alive." Yet no death certificates were filed, no burial permits, just a note in a margin, scribbled hastily, "Do not inquire further." And so we come back to the vow, the silence. Not just a rejection of speech, but a rejection of participation, a full removal from the mechanisms of the world. If silence is a protest, theirs was the most extreme. If silence is a defense, theirs was impenetrable. And if silence is a warning, then what were they trying to stop us from hearing? Or worse, what were they afraid we might say aloud? These are not just superstitions, they are fractures in the timeline. Places where the official story bends, cracks, and collapses under the weight of what's been hidden. 14 women didn't vanish, they became a living seal. And when that seal broke in 1963, the world felt it but couldn't explain it. War escalated, social institutions began to disintegrate, faith fragmented, and truth became negotiable. All just a coincidence? Or did the silence that once held back the tide finally dissolve, leaving us exposed to something we were never meant to face? You see, there's power in silence, but there's even more power in knowing when it ends. And perhaps that's the real terror, that someday, somewhere, someone will speak again. And when they do, everything we believe about history, about faith, about human nature might be undone in a single whispered sentence. They said the convent had been abandoned in 1891, that the women inside were long gone, that their faith had simply dissolved like dust. But what they didn't tell you, what no one tells you, is that the seals on the stone walls were never broken, that the candles never truly went out, that within those cold Gothic chambers, silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a covenant, a pact, a binding ritual that no man dared challenge. You see, the story of the 14 nuns of St. Hilaria doesn't begin with their devotion. It begins with their disappearance from the world. One by one, they withdrew not into exile, but into something much deeper, something that was never meant for human memory. When the first investigator, Father Calloway, was sent by the Archdiocese in 1892, what he found shattered him. The official report stated no signs of life, but in the margins of his handwritten notes, later discovered buried in the Vatican's restricted archives, were chilling phrases: unnatural quiet, echoes don't return. Eyes watching from stone. He was reassigned, silenced. The second visitor, a bishop with connections to old European orders, refused to even enter the inner sanctum. "It is not abandonment," he wrote, "it is containment." But what needed containing? And why had the Church spent more than 6 decades funding the maintenance of a convent that held no public services, no visitors, and no known occupants? Local legends spoke of the black hour, an ungodly moment just before dawn when the chapel bells, disconnected from rope and rusted through, would chime on their own. Townsfolk claimed they heard chanting that wasn't in Latin, wasn't in any known tongue, and always ended with a sudden, visceral scream, one that didn't echo through the hills but inside your head. We found correspondence from Sister Magdalena, the last novice to be allowed in before the vow was sealed. In her final letter, smudged with candle wax and written in trembling hand, she warned, "They do not pray as we do. They face no altar. Their faith is not in salvation, but in secrecy. They chant backwards, they fast from light, they wait for someone to return." The letter was intercepted and buried in the Jesuit vaults, labeled under heretical delusions. But delusions do not leave footprints, and yet, in 1903, a team of structural engineers hired to assess the crumbling foundations of St. Hilaria reported something impossible: fresh footsteps in the dust, leading to the crypt beneath the altar, footsteps that vanished at the base of the sealed staircase, as though the stone had swallowed them whole. The crypt itself was not listed in any architectural plans. The blueprints submitted to the city in 1840 end at the altar. But beneath that sacred space lies an antechamber older than the convent itself, carved not with Christian crosses, but with sigils, symbols matching those found in pre-Christian catacombs in Eastern Europe. Symbols associated with apocryphal sects, secret languages, and sacrificial rites older than Christ. No one can explain how 14 cloistered women could learn these symbols, or why they began carving them into their own skin. A surviving page from the convent's private rulebook, bound in lambskin, written in a ciphered dialect, was decrypted by a rogue linguist. In 1951, it read, "To guard the breach, we must become the wall. To silence the voice, we must erase the ear. To keep the one below from rising, we must vow never to rise ourselves." That's not devotion, that's imprisonment. You see, The vow they took wasn't one of poverty, chastity, or obedience. It was a vow of sealing, a ritual of containment passed down through whispered traditions, likely originating in the forgotten cults of Anatolia and Mesopotamia. But it didn't die there. It was hidden within the habits of women taught to vanish. The nuns of St. Hilaria were not saints, they were sentinels, and they were not alone, because here's the secret, they never wanted out. Every 50 years, the seal must be renewed, not with prayer, with presence, with breath, with blood. That's why in 1942, during the height of World War II, a secret Vatican envoy visited the ruins under cover of night. They were there to perform the ritual again, but this time, only 12 returned. To this day, no one knows what happened to the 2 who vanished. But we do know this. The night they disappeared, the bells of St. Hilaria rang 13 times, and no one heard the scream because it wasn't meant for the ears of the living. It was a scream for the thing that listens from the other side. Of the seal, the vow wasn't a spiritual promise. It was a containment strategy. And the question that remains haunting, unanswered, isn't why the nuns took it. It's what happens if it ever breaks. They tell you that silence is peace. That when the noise dies down, the soul finds rest. But in St. Hilaria, silence was not peace, it was pressure. A constant, humming force that seemed to press inward from the stone walls, as though the very air had been pulled thin, taut like a veil stretched across a gaping wound. And behind that veil, something stirred. The convent's inner chapel, a structure supposedly untouched since the vow was made, hides something grotesque, something even the church would not consecrate. Beneath the altar, under layers of sealed stone, lies the chamber of the bound. That's not a metaphor. In 1966, a team of unauthorized Vatican archivists accessed suppressed files known only by their black wax insignia files marked Ordo Umbri. Within them were sketches, not of relics, not of architecture, but of human forms, limbs bound with linens soaked in ash, mouths sewn shut with golden wire, eyes wide and cracked, pupils scoured out. The notes referred to these figures only as custodes, interdict of the forbidden watchers. Who were they watching, or what? The rituals of St. Hilaria were not solitary. They required witnesses. Witnesses who could never speak of what they saw. Witnesses who would be entombed, but never allowed to die. Evidence suggests that during the final sealing ceremony, in 1889, 14 nuns took the vow, but only if 14 watchers were already in place, bound to remain alert beneath the chapel, even as their bodies withered into something less than human but more than dead. There are no names attached to the watchers, no orders, no graves, only drawings, grotesque, childlike sketches from the hand of Sister Elisha rendered in charcoal and sealed with blood. And then there's the manuscript found in 1984, a single copy. No cover, no title, just 108 pages of tight Manic script in Old Sardinian, discovered in the ruins of an underground chamber 40 miles from St. Hilaria. The author is unknown, but scholars believe it to be one of the original architects of the vow, possibly a nun who fled before the final sealing. The last 10 pages are incomprehensible, a blend of geometric shapes, reversed musical notation, and untranslated phonetic chants. But the first line, "Do not pray to be saved. Pray that it never wakes." But something did wake, because in 1991, during a seismic survey of the valley near the convent, a geologist reported anomalies beneath the hill, vibrations with rhythmic patterns, like a pulse. His equipment registered what he described as a slow, angry heartbeat emanating from beneath the chapel. The report was confiscated within 48 hours. The man who wrote it, gone, last seen boarding a train in Milan, never arrived. And what of the seal, what of the vow? In 2002, a group of amateur historians and urban explorers trespassed onto the site of St. Hilaria. They live-streamed their exploration. For the first hour, everything was mockery and jokes. But then they found the door, iron, rusted, carved with symbols no one could recognize. On camera, one of them placed his hand upon it. There was a sound not like wind, not like stone, like a breath inhaling through centuries of dust. The stream cut out, authorities said. It was a hoax, that the building collapsed, but in one final frame, frozen by internet archivists before the footage was deleted, the door is open. Not broken, open, and behind it nothing but darkness. Darkness so total it absorbed the light from their torches. Darkness that didn't reflect, didn't return. That's when the town changed. Locals began reporting sleep paralysis, collective nightmares, children waking with identical bruises on their arm circles like rings of rope, pets vanishing, A priest, Father Grimaldi, publicly declared the town under spiritual siege and was immediately discredited, relocated to a facility in southern Italy. His personal notes, smuggled out by a sympathetic nun, included the line, "The vow was broken, the watchers blinked, and the seal is no longer closed. You understand now, don't you? This isn't the story of faith, it's the story of a prison maintained by silence, suffering, and sacrifice. 14 women gave their voices, their lives, their very beings to keep it bound, and someone, somewhere, allowed that vow to lapse, and what they were containing isn't human, isn't spirit, isn't myth, it is need, hunger, memory that devours, and it remembers you. It remembers all of us. We were never supposed to speak of this, but now we have, and with each word spoken aloud, each secret exposed, the vow weakens further, and so we ask, no, we beg, stay silent, not out of reverence, but out of fear, because the bells of St. Hilaria are tolling again, and this time they're ringing for you. They never rebuilt St. Hilaria, no restoration, no tourist preservation, not even a plaque. It's as if the land itself rejected the memory of what happened there. But the silence didn't die, it migrated. Reports from nearby villages began surfacing, whispers of women, in old habits, walking barefoot through fields at night, their mouths sewn shut with strands of rosary chain, eyes weeping blood. Locals don't speak of it, they just turn their porch lights off before dusk, and keep crucifixes nailed to every door, not out of belief, but as a warning, or a ward. You see, the vow didn't end, it just detached from the convent and the women who bound it, drifting like smoke into the air, looking for new hosts, new vessels. In the town of Valdese, a 6-year-old girl stopped speaking overnight. She began drawing circles on the floor in ash, sitting inside them for hours with her eyes closed. When her parents tried to intervene, she screamed not with her voice, but with something that shook the walls, cracked the windows, and left them bleeding from the ears. Her drawings, identical to those found in the original chamber of the bound. This isn't isolated. In 2011, a Vatican cryptographer named Rinaldi came forward under whistleblower protections. His testimony, suppressed and buried in legal purgatory, described a network of similar convents across Europe, each founded in silence, each sealed by vows of containment, not prayer. They weren't religious centers, they were vaults, and St. Hilaria was the deepest, the oldest, the last one holding, and it fell, but no one in power will acknowledge it. Because to admit the vow's collapse is to admit the presence of what it held. The Church has issued quiet directives to local parishes. Prayers of the mute saint are to be discontinued. Relics associated with St. Hilaria are to be destroyed or entombed in salt and lead. All nuns bearing her name are to be reassigned, or quietly retired. And then there are the voices, not the ones from the past, but from the static, from radio towers, shortwave frequencies, disrupted phone calls. People are hearing phrases in dead dialects. In one case, a Polish truck driver crossed the Alps and claimed he heard a woman reciting Psalm 88 backwards over his CB radio, in Latin, while the air around his cab dropped 30 degrees. The tape he recorded has never been authenticated, but in the background, something clicks, regularly, like a metronome, like footsteps. What's emerging isn't just history, it's something sentient. It doesn't want worship. It doesn't want blood, it wants quiet, perfect, suffocating, irreversible quiet, the kind where nothing is born, nothing moves, where time itself forgets to tick. And here's the final horror. In 2023, satellite imagery from a classified European surveillance project leaked by an anonymous analyst revealed a shadow stretching from the hill where St. Hilaria once stood. But the shadow didn't follow the sun, it moved against it. It stretched across the valley like a wound opening in daylight. And at the edge of that shadow, there stood a single figurehead bowed, hands clasped, onmoving. When the image was analyzed under spectral light, the figure wasn't casting a shadow at all, it was absorbing them. You still think this is a story, a myth to scare children? Look around. Listen to the growing silence in your cities, the way people speak less, connect less, how every word online feels hollow, echoing into nothing. We're not evolving, we're being hushed, prepared, tuned to stillness. The vow wasn't just about silence, it was about sealing the world from something louder than God, and now it's listening, and then came the disappearances, not of people, of sound. In the months following the satellite leak, entire regions began reporting audio blackouts. At first, it seemed technological radio dead zones, sudden drops in telecommunications, But then came the natural silences. Birds stopped singing at dawn in northern Italy. Wind failed to make a sound when it passed through Swiss pines. Entire stretches of forest registered no ambient noise on parabolic mics, no insects, no rustling, not even the crack of settling wood. It was as though sound itself was being erased. Military teams were dispatched in unmarked transports, not to fight, but to listen. They deployed specialized acoustic sensors, some of which went missing, along with their operators. Survivors described a phenomenon they called auditory inversion, where the world sounded reversed, like whispers bleeding in before the speaker opened their mouth, as if something else was rehearsing their words just ahead of them. In Vatican archives, long classified, there's a phrase scrawled in the margins of a 17th century codex related to the St. Hilaire order, vox mortuae portat sigillum, the dead voice carries the seal. That's not metaphor, it's instruction. Because there was always one final vow, one deeper than silence, one more terrifying than isolation, the vow of surrender, in their final ritual. The 14 nuns didn't just seal themselves away, they relinquished their names, their faith, even their individual will, not to God, but to the entity they were keeping chained behind the veil of sound. They offered themselves as vessels of containment, not through exorcism, but submission. Their silence wasn't a rejection of the world, it was a binding contract, and now the contract has expired. Whispers are being reported in government buildings, officials speaking in their sleep in ancient Sumeric dialects, words that predate language. A closed-door psychological assessment at an undisclosed U.S. military base ended in 5 personnel clawing out their own ears. One wrote in blood, "It once a cathedral of quiet. We gave it one once. We tore it down, and now it's building again. But this time, not with stone. It's building in our minds, in our culture, in the way we retreat from conversation, numb ourselves with distraction, avoid uncomfortable truths. Every moment you choose not to speak, not to connect, you're laying another brick. Every time you silence your intuition, bow to censorship, or choose the algorithm over authenticity, you are worshipping at its altar." The vow is no longer a ritual, it's a virus, a philosophy, a new theology of absence disguised as peace, and soon, there will be no need to silence us, because we'll silence ourselves, and that's why the final recordings were never released to the public. Not because of fear, because of certainty. There exists a reel archived in a sealed vault beneath the ruins of the sanctum of St. Hilaire, reel marked not with words, but a series of concentric spirals burnt into the film's edge. Those who've heard it don't describe it as audio, they describe it as weight, as if the air in the room becomes thicker, pressing against the skull and spine, making thoughts viscous. One Vatican technician who accidentally played 3 seconds of it before cutting power described the sensation as a memory of a scream that had never been made. The silence in the recording is not empty, it is inhabited. There are no voices, but there is presence, and when you hear it, you feel seen, not by God, not by anything human, but by something older than reverence, older than fear, something that never needed a name, only permission. A team of modern acoustic scientists once attempted to digitize a portion of the reel for study. The servers used in the operation corrupted instantly, not just the file, the entire network. Data unrecoverable, drives melted from the inside. One cryptographer described the incident as a sound that didn't want to be known by numbers. He left the project. Weeks later, he took a vow of silence. Not religious, protective, and here's the part no one talks about. It's spreading again. The architecture of silence is no longer contained to the monastery. It has found new temples. You see them every day: soundproof offices, noise-canceling headphones, smart homes designed to eliminate the world outside. Places that make silence seem like a luxury, a choice. But it was never a choice, it was always a design. Silence has become the new virtue, a new form of control. Speak the wrong thing, and you're punished. Ask the wrong questions, and you're shunned. Challenge the approved narrative, and your voice is buried not by violence, but by silence, by digital omission, by algorithms that erase your existence pixel by pixel. And while we sleep under the illusion of peace, the old vow is kept alive not by monks or nuns, but by systems, by protocols, by policies designed to scrub noise from the record, until only sanctioned silence remains. You're not just witnessing history, you're participating in ritual, and the entity that those 14 nuns once imprisoned, it no longer needs the monastery. It lives in the silence. Between us now, there are symbols being carved again, not in stone, not in wood, in the minds of children. Across the US, a pattern is re-emerging, and related children, from opposite ends, of the country, sketching identical spiral designs into their notebooks. Their parents think it's harmless, artistic, but if you overlay those symbols onto the architectural floor plans of the original sanctum of St. Hilaria, something becomes clear. The children are unconsciously redrawing the monastery, not as it was meant to be, a reconstruction through memory, not their own. One 8-year-old girl in Vermont began speaking in her sleep in a cadence that matched a chant, transcribed from the order's forgotten hymns. Her family isn't religious. She's never heard Latin, and yet, during one particularly intense sleep episode, she whispered a phrase that translated to, "It walks where the silence is deepest." Another boy in Arizona drew blueprints, not of buildings, of echo chambers, rooms designed so that sound never escapes, rooms mathematically perfect in silence. It's not just imagination, it's transmission. And that's the final layer of the vow repetition. The entity doesn't spread like a pathogen, it spreads like a liturgy, a rhythm, a recursion of silence so perfected it begins to resonate inside you. It uses memory as medium, innocence as amplifier. Children don't resist the silence, they emulate it. They worship it without even knowing why. This isn't new. This is ancient liturgical technology, buried beneath the surface of history, reawakening in the neural pathways of a new generation. You've seen it before in the dead stares of youth scrolling in silence, in the vacant halls of modern churches turned performance centers, in the global disappearance of communal sound singing, storytelling, even screaming. When's the last time you heard someone truly scream? Not in media, in life. We've trained ourselves out of making noise, and that's exactly what it wanted. Because once the world becomes silent enough, it will speak again. Not in language, in resonance. You won't hear it with ears, you'll feel it in your blood. There was a final act of desperation, one that was never recorded in Vatican logs, never included in any confession or sacred archive. It came not from Rome, not from theologians or scholars, but from a defector, a young novitiate named Clara Vasina, who broke her final vows in order to smuggle a torn piece of parchment from the inner sanctum of St. Hilaria before the monastery was sealed. The parchment was old, pre-Christian. It spoke of resonant architecture, structures designed not to shelter the body but to modulate the human soul, a place where the angle of every stone, the curve of every corridor, wasn't built for beauty or shelter, but for containment. Containment of something not meant to walk this earth. The sanctum was never a convent, it was a prison, and the nuns were not caretakers, they were guards. Clara's parchment contained the only known set of disruption phrases, not prayers, not exorcisms, but tonal equations, spoken in a specific cadence, meant to jam the transmission of the entity's influence. It wasn't enough to defeat it, only to interrupt it, temporarily, and only if spoken aloud. But here's the twist: the moment you utter these phrases, you become visible to it. Not spiritually, acoustically, like a beacon cutting through the fog of silence. You become a disturbance in its field, a blasphemy, and it hunts blasphemies with precision. Clara spoke them once. She was found 3 days later, her vocal cords ruptured from the inside, not cut, not torn, undone, as though the structure of her voice had been erased retroactively. The parchment lost, but fragments remain copied by hand into the margins of a burned hymnal hidden in a subchapel beneath Prague. Monks from the Order of St. Elijah attempted to reconstruct it. Only 2 of the original 12 researchers remain sane. Both are mute by choice. They say the phrases still work, but they come at a cost. The world today is quieter than ever, but not because we've found peace. Because the most dangerous truth is this: every time a generation forgets how to speak the wrong thing, the prison cracks a little more, and when enough cracks form, the silence won't need walls anymore. Now we arrive at the most disturbing part. What happened after the vow? After the silence? After the sealing of the monastery? Because despite what the church claimed, the structure wasn't abandoned, it was watched. For decades, in the 1940s, American intelligence operatives under the OSS stumbled across Vatican archives during covert operations in fascist Italy. Among cryptic war dossiers, they found sealed records marked with a sigil not seen in any Christian order, the coiled eye. That sigil traced back to only one location, St. Hilaria. A special unit codenamed Project Murmur was formed under psychological warfare divisions. They weren't interested in theology. They were interested in acoustic influence, the ability to control masses through structured silence. Engineers, sound designers, and early pioneers of frequency-based mind alteration were deployed to the ruins. Something went wrong. The entire Team 12 men ceased radio transmissions 72 hours into the mission. When backup arrived, the base camp was intact, gear untouched, rations still sealed. But the men were gone, all except one, a technician named Howard Reese, who was found crawling naked along the chapel's inner walls, his mouth sealed with mortar and bits of cloth, his own uniform. When they finally broke the seal, Reese whispered just 2 words. He's singing. They brought him back to the US, confined him to a black site facility in West Virginia. Medical notes, declassified in 1997, show Reese would hum for hours on end, not melodies, but single tones, frequencies precisely mapped at 19 Hz, froze sound just below the range of human hearing, but known to cause anxiety, hallucinations, and paranoia. That same frequency was later detected inside public school HVA systems in 6 US states between 1961 and 1983. No one knows why, but guess what appeared in student drawings during that time? The spiral. The monastery had been breached, and the silence, the engineered silence, had begun leaking out, not through speech, through architecture, through air, through forgotten frequencies, and the subtle redesign of modern buildings meant to look sleek, but act like resonance chambers. You felt it, the disquiet in elevators, the dread in parking structures, the nausea in certain schools or hospitals where nothing feels wrong but everything is. That's the shadow of St. Hilaria. The vow wasn't just a personal ritual, it was a system, and now that system is waking up in the foundations beneath your feet. And now, we come full circle, not to an ending, but to a return, because what vanished behind monastery walls never stayed buried. It simply changed form. The vow was never just a silence of the mouth, it was a silence of memory, a ritual of forgetting, a suppression of every impulse that makes us human, to question, to cry out, to warn others. But the structure didn't vanish. It was simply renamed. You see, St. Hilaria was quietly purchased in 1989 by a corporate entity disguised as a European Heritage Preservation Trust, but no restoration occurred. Instead, heavy data cables were funneled through the surrounding hillside, sensor nodes were embedded inside the foundation, and thermal imaging visible only from declassified satellite sweeps shows something horrifying: movement, constant, rhythmic, geometric movement beneath the chapel floor. Not animals, not plumbing, patterns, pacing, circles, spirals, as if something below still walks in loops it cannot break. Here's the real secret. The vow still exists, it's just digital. Now whispers once buried in stone and blood now exist in server farms, coded in compression algorithms, hidden in latency gaps, and buried in the silent gaps between audio tracks on corporate music streaming platforms. An entire generation has grown up conditioned not to speak but to scroll, to observe, to mute themselves for fear of being offensive, irrelevant, or wrong. Silence has evolved. What once required monks in stone chambers now requires only you, agreeing to terms and conditions. There are modern nuns now, not in habit or cloister but in sleek boardrooms and server rooms, managing algorithms whose only function is to erase dissent, subdue outbursts, and flatten frequency. Because the entity doesn't care how you speak. It only needs you to stop speaking loudly enough to disrupt it. It fears resonance, it fears raw, human, unfiltered noise. You ever wonder why toddlers scream at frequencies that make adults flinch? It's not random, it's natural rebellion. The vow is alive, but so is the countersignal, and maybe the last hope isn't a sacred chant or lost prayer. It's in us remembering how to make noise again, because the only thing that keeps the darkness sealed is the sound of something that refuses to be silenced. And so we end, not with closure but with a choice, because now you know. You've heard the tale you weren't supposed to hear. You've walked the ruined halls of St. Hilaria, felt the hum beneath your skin, and stared into the spiral etched into forgotten stone. You've glimpsed the design behind the vow, the psychological architecture, the acoustic manipulation, the encoded silence that doesn't merely hush voices, it rebuilds minds. And you must now ask yourself, what have you taken a vow of silence against? Not to protect others, not to preserve peace, but to survive a system that punishes truth, isolates honesty, and buries the human scream beneath layers of civility, productivity, and fear. The story of the 14 nuns is not a relic, it is a blueprint, and its influence has stretched its fingers into your office buildings, your schools, your churches, your feeds, every algorithm that rewards quiet compliance, every rule that bans noise, chaos, or disruption, every voice in your head that tells you don't say that, don't post that, don't be seen. That's the vow. You may not live in a monastery, but you've been walled in. You may not have sewn your lips shut, but you've swallowed screams. You may not hear the chanting, but you feel it. In the dead quiet of corporate meetings, in the polite nods at funerals where nobody dares cry, in the sterile hum of rooms where people used to shout and dance and argue. St. Hilaria was not destroyed, it was franchised, replicated, in the blueprints of every lifeless public space, spread through every passive digital silence, perfected in a world that trains you to whisper, and calls it growth. But if you've made it this far, with your pulse quickened, your breath caught, your thoughts shook, then the vow has cracked, even slightly. The system felt you wake up, the hum got louder, the spiral twitched, and maybe, just maybe, that's all it takes to begin the reversal, because the spiral spins in both directions, and if silence is the tool they use to seal away the truth, then your voice, raw, human, unfiltered, furious, may be the only thing that can unseal it. Now go, shatter the quiet, and never let the vow take root in you again.